The morning Claire Whitfield's husband told her to pack her bags because his pregnant mistress was moving in that same afternoon, she was holding a small manila envelope she had just picked up from the mailbox, an envelope that, within the hour, would make him fall to his knees and beg her to stay. If you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in second chances, and in the quiet power of hope even when life feels like it's ending, I want to invite you to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to our channel. Stories like this one belong to all of us, and our community grows stronger every time we choose to believe that broken things can still be mended. Now, let's begin. Claire Whitfield was 44 years old, and for 22 of those years she had been married to a man named Gregory Whitfield, a real estate developer who had built half the shopping plazas in their small Ohio town of Millbrook. She had met him when she was a wide-eyed college graduate working at a bakery near his first construction site, and he had walked in every morning for 3 weeks straight just to see her smile before he finally asked her to dinner. Back then, Gregory had been a man of modest means with big dreams and rough hands, the kind of man who talked about the future with his whole chest, and Claire had fallen for him the way young women fall for men who promise them the world and mean it, at least for a while. They built a life together in a house on Larkspur Lane, a house Claire had chosen every curtain for, every doorknob, every shade of paint on every wall. She had given up her own dream of opening a bakery to raise their 2 children, Nathaniel and Josephine, and to support Gregory as his business grew from a single construction crew into a company with his name on office buildings across 3 counties. She had hosted his clients for dinner, memorized their allergies and their children's names, smiled through years of missed anniversaries and cancelled vacations, and told herself that love, real love, meant sacrifice. She believed that if she gave enough, waited long enough, and loved him patiently enough, he would eventually come home to her fully, not just in body but in spirit. But somewhere in the last 3 years, Gregory had drifted. Claire noticed it the way you notice a slow leak in a tire, not all at once but in small signs that accumulate until the thing finally goes flat. He worked later. He took calls in the garage with the door shut. He stopped reaching for her hand in the car. She told herself it was stress, the economy, his father's declining health, the weight of running a company with 40 employees depending on him. She made him coffee in the mornings and packed his lunches even though he was a grown man who could pack his own, because that was how she loved him, in small, quiet, thankless gestures that she hoped would remind him of who they used to be. She did not know, until the morning everything changed, that for the last 14 months, Gregory had been seeing a 31-year-old marketing consultant named Vanessa Cole, a woman he had hired to rebrand his company's image, a woman with sharp cheekbones and an easy laugh who made him feel, as he would later admit in a moment of cruel honesty, young again. Claire did not know that Vanessa was 7 months pregnant. She did not know that Gregory had already signed the lease on an apartment for her, had already picked out a crib, had already imagined a whole new chapter of his life that did not include the woman who had spent half her life beside him. She found out on a Tuesday morning in April, the kind of soft, golden morning where the dogwood trees in the front yard were just beginning to bloom and the whole neighborhood smelled like rain and cut grass. Claire was in the kitchen making Gregory's coffee out of habit, still in her robe, humming along to the radio, when he walked in already dressed for work, his face unusually stiff, his jaw tight in a way she recognized from 30 years of marriage as the look he wore before delivering bad news to an investor. She asked him what was wrong, and for a long moment he said nothing, just stood there gripping the back of a kitchen chair like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Then he told her. He told her about Vanessa. He told her about the baby. He told her, in a voice that trembled with something that might have been guilt or might have simply been nerves, that he needed her to move out of the house by the end of the week because Vanessa was due in 2 months and he wanted the nursery ready, he wanted their child to come home to a proper family, he wanted, God help him, a fresh start. He said the word family as though Claire had never been part of one, as though 22 years and 2 children and a life built brick by brick in that very house counted for nothing next to a baby that did not yet exist outside its mother's body. Claire did not scream. She did not cry, not at first. She simply stood very still, holding the coffee pot in her hand, watching the man she had loved since she was 22 years old tell her that her life, as she knew it, was over. She felt something crack inside her chest, not loudly, but with the quiet, final sound of a foundation giving way after years of unseen stress. She set the coffee pot down carefully, because some part of her, even in that moment, could not bring herself to shatter something in the kitchen she had built with her own hands. Gregory, perhaps mistaking her silence for acceptance, kept talking. He said he would be generous. He said he would make sure she was taken care of financially, that she would want for nothing, that this was not about money, it was about happiness, his happiness, and didn't she want him to be happy? He said all of this while checking his watch, because he had a meeting at 9, because even in the moment he was ending his marriage, there was somewhere else he needed to be. It was Josephine, their 20-year-old daughter, who found Claire an hour later sitting on the porch steps in her robe, staring blankly at the dogwood tree, the morning mail still unopened in her lap. Josephine had come home from college for the weekend and had not expected to walk into the wreckage of her parents' marriage before breakfast. When she asked her mother what was wrong, Claire could not speak. She simply handed her daughter the stack of mail, as though the answer to everything might somehow be contained in bills and catalogs, and it was there, buried between a water bill and a furniture store flyer, that Claire noticed a manila envelope with no return address, her name typed neatly across the front in a font that looked almost official. She had picked it up from the mailbox that very morning, just minutes before Gregory delivered his devastating news, and in the chaos of the last hour she had completely forgotten she was holding it. Josephine, seeing her mother's hands shaking too badly to open it, tore the envelope open herself. Inside was a letter from a law office in Columbus, along with a set of documents that made Josephine's eyes go wide as she read them, and then read them again, and then looked up at her mother with an expression Claire had never seen on her daughter's face before, something between shock and disbelief and the faintest, dangerous flicker of hope. The letter was from an estate attorney representing the family of Eleanor Whitfield, Gregory's aunt, a reclusive woman who had lived alone on a large property outside of town and whom Claire had visited faithfully every month for the last 15 years, long after Gregory himself had stopped bothering, dismissing his aunt as a bitter old woman who talked too much about the past. Claire had never done it for any reason other than kindness. Eleanor had no children of her own, and something in her sharp, lonely eyes had always reminded Claire of her own late mother. Claire brought her soup when she was sick, sat with her through long afternoons of old records and older stories, and listened patiently to the tales of a woman the rest of the family had quietly written off as difficult. Eleanor Whitfield had passed away 6 weeks earlier, a fact Claire had known and grieved privately, having attended the small funeral alone because Gregory had claimed he was too busy with a project deadline. What Claire had not known was that in the final year of her life, Eleanor had quietly rewritten her will. The letter explained, in careful legal language, that Eleanor Whitfield had left the entirety of her estate, including a piece of commercial property downtown valued at just under $2 million, and, more importantly, a controlling minority share in Whitfield Development Group that Eleanor had secretly acquired decades earlier as a silent investor in her nephew's very first construction project, not to Gregory, but to Claire. The letter explained that Eleanor had left a personal note attached to the will, which the attorney had enclosed separately, sealed, addressed simply to Claire, who never stopped showing up. Josephine read the legal summary aloud in a shaking voice on the porch steps while her mother sat frozen beside her, and by the time she finished, both women were crying, though for entirely different reasons layered together in a single overwhelming moment: grief for a woman who had quietly loved Claire when almost no one else had bothered to see her, and something like disbelieving, fragile astonishment at what this letter meant for the day that had just begun to unravel. Because buried in the fine print of Eleanor's shares was a clause that changed everything. Eleanor's minority stake, combined with certain buyback provisions Gregory had signed years earlier during a cash-strapped period of the company's early growth, meant that Claire now held enough leverage to significantly influence, and under certain conditions even block, major company decisions, including refinancing, asset transfers, and, crucially, any attempt Gregory might make to liquidate shared marital assets for a divorce settlement without her full cooperation. In simpler terms, the very foundation Gregory had built his empire on now had a brick that belonged to the wife he had just told to leave. Gregory did not know any of this yet. He had left for his 9 o'clock meeting without a second glance at the porch where his wife and daughter sat holding a piece of paper that would soon bring his entire world to a halt. Claire, for her part, did not immediately feel triumphant. She felt, more than anything, a strange, aching tenderness for Eleanor, a woman who had apparently seen something in her that even Claire had stopped seeing in herself, a woman who had spent her final months quietly making sure that if the day ever came when Claire needed protection, she would have it, even from beyond the grave. Josephine wanted to call her father immediately, wanted to march into his office and watch his face when he realized what he had done, but Claire, wiping her eyes, shook her head slowly. She said she did not want revenge. She said, in a voice that surprised even herself with its calm, that she wanted the truth to come out on its own, in its own time, the way truth always eventually does, and that she needed time first to simply sit with what had happened to her marriage before she decided what to do with what Eleanor had given her. It was, perhaps, the first purely selfish decision Claire had made in years, choosing to protect her own heart before rushing to manage everyone else's reactions, and it felt, strangely, like the beginning of something. Over the following days, Claire did not move out. She did not pack a single box. She continued sleeping in the guest room, not out of spite, but because some deep, tired part of her needed the familiar walls of the house she had built while she figured out what came next. Gregory, arriving home each evening expecting to find suitcases by the door, found instead a wife who greeted him with quiet, unreadable calm, who continued making dinner for herself and sometimes, out of old habit she couldn't quite break, for him too, though she no longer sat across from him while he ate it. He grew increasingly agitated as the days passed, pressing her about when she planned to move out, reminding her that Vanessa's due date was approaching, that the nursery needed painting, that he had already told his mistress the house would be ready soon. Claire listened to all of this with a strange new detachment, as though she were watching a man she used to know from a great distance. She did not argue. She simply told him, each time, that she needed a little more time, and something in her tone, calm and unshaken in a way it had never been before, unsettled him more than tears or shouting ever could have. It was Nathaniel, their 23-year-old son who worked as a junior accountant at his father's own company, who inadvertently set the collapse in motion. Nathaniel had grown up idolizing his father, had followed him into the family business hoping to earn the kind of pride Gregory rarely gave freely, and it was through his access to internal company documents that he first noticed something strange in the shareholder records that week. An update flagged by the legal department regarding a change in beneficiary status for a minority stake previously held under the name Eleanor R. Whitfield. Confused, he asked one of the company's paralegals about it, a young woman named Priya who had been copied on the estate correspondence, and within the hour, without any dramatic intention, simply through the ordinary churn of office gossip, word began to spread that Gregory Whitfield's wife now held a stake in the company that could not simply be ignored. Gregory found out not from Claire, but from his own lawyer, who called him in a state of controlled panic during a lunch meeting with investors, informing him that any attempt to transfer, refinance, or leverage company assets, including the very apartment he had leased for Vanessa using a company credit line meant for client entertainment, could now be legally challenged by his wife's newly acquired position, and that if she chose to exercise her rights as a shareholder, she could delay, complicate, or in certain structured scenarios even prevent, a clean and quiet divorce settlement that would allow him to walk away with the company intact. Gregory left the lunch meeting early, his face the color of old paper, and drove straight home in the middle of a workday for the first time in years. He found Claire in the garden, kneeling in the soil where she had been quietly replanting the flower beds she had let go untended during the hardest weeks of her marriage, her hands dark with earth, a smear of dirt across her cheek where she had brushed away sweat. He stood over her, and for a long moment he said nothing, and Claire, without looking up, calmly asked if he had come to help her with the tulips. It was then that Gregory Whitfield, a man who had built shopping plazas and negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts without breaking a sweat, sank down onto the grass beside his wife and, in a voice cracking with something that sounded almost like fear, asked her what Eleanor had done. Claire finally looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw not the wounded, desperate woman he had expected to find, the one he had assumed would beg him to stay or collapse into tears at the mention of his mistress, but someone new, someone quietly, terrifyingly at peace with whatever came next. She told him the truth, simply and without embellishment. She told him about the letter, about Eleanor's decades of silent belief in Claire long after the rest of the family had stopped seeing her at all, about the shares, about the note that had been sealed just for her which she had not yet even brought herself to open, wanting to save Eleanor's private words for a quieter moment. She told him that she had not planned any of this, had not schemed or manipulated, had simply been, for 15 years, a woman who showed up for a lonely old aunt because it was the right thing to do, never imagining it would matter for anything beyond the comfort it gave a dying woman. Gregory put his face in his hands, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, Claire watched her husband cry, not the performative frustration of a man losing control of a negotiation, but something rawer, older, the crumbling of a man realizing that the wife he had discarded so casually held, without ever intending to, the power to unmake everything he had built. He begged her, then, not to ruin him, not to punish him through the company, not to take from Nathaniel and Josephine's futures out of anger at their father. Claire listened to all of it, and when he finished, she told him something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. She told him she had no interest in ruining him. She had spent 22 years building this life beside him, and she was not going to spend whatever came next tearing it down out of spite. But she also told him, with a steadiness that left no room for argument, that she was done being told what she deserved by a man who had already decided her worth was less than a woman 14 years her junior with a baby he found more exciting than the family he already had. In the days that followed, something shifted between them that neither could have predicted. Gregory, stripped of his illusion of total control, began to see Claire not as the compliant wife he had taken for granted but as a woman with her own history, her own quiet strength, her own capacity to walk away entirely if she chose to. Vanessa, upon learning that the apartment lease and the company credit line funding it were now under threat of legal scrutiny, and realizing that Gregory's financial future was suddenly far less certain than he had promised her, grew cold and distant, eventually telling Gregory in a brief, business-like phone call that she needed a partner she could rely on, not a man in the middle of a legal mess, and that she would be raising the baby on her own terms, with lawyers of her own involved to ensure fair support. The great romance Gregory had upended his family for revealed itself, in the harsh light of consequence, to be built on far shallower ground than the marriage he had so carelessly discarded. Claire did not gloat over this. When Josephine, still furious on her mother's behalf, expressed something close to satisfaction at the news, Claire only shook her head gently and said that there was a baby coming into the world who deserved better than to be a pawn in anyone's story of vengeance or vindication, and that whatever had happened between the adults, that child was innocent and would need love from whoever could offer it, herself included, someday, if it ever came to that. It was in moments like these that Josephine began to understand something about her mother she had never fully appreciated before, that Claire's gentleness was not weakness, had never been weakness, but a kind of quiet, deliberate strength that chose compassion even when cruelty would have been so much easier to justify. Nathaniel, meanwhile, struggled with his own reckoning. He had spent years believing his father was the model of the man he wanted to become, and watching Gregory unravel, watching the company he had proudly joined tremble under the weight of his father's choices, forced him to separate, for the first time, the idea of his father from the reality of him. He came to his mother one evening, sitting across from her at the kitchen table where she had once packed his father's lunches, and asked her, in the small, uncertain voice he used to have as a boy, whether she still loved his father at all. Claire considered the question for a long time before answering honestly that love, real love built over decades, does not simply disappear the moment it is betrayed, but that loving someone and choosing to remain tethered to the wreckage they've made of your life were two very different things, and that she was still learning, every day, how to hold both truths without losing herself in either. Weeks passed, and the legal complexities of the shareholder situation forced Gregory and Claire into repeated meetings with lawyers, meetings that were tense and businesslike at first but slowly, unexpectedly, became something else. In negotiating what was fair, what was owed, what the future of the company and the family should look like, Gregory was forced to actually listen to Claire, perhaps for the first time in years, not as a wife whose opinions he could nod through absently while thinking of something else, but as an equal whose decisions now directly shaped his future. He began to see, with something like shame, how much of her he had simply stopped noticing, how many of her sacrifices he had accepted as background noise rather than gifts freely given. One afternoon in early June, in a moment neither of them planned, Gregory found himself standing again in the garden, watching Claire tend to the same flower beds, and he asked her, quietly, without any of his old confidence, whether there was any version of the future where they might find their way back to each other, not as the people they had been, but as something new, something honestly rebuilt. Claire did not answer right away. She sat back on her heels, wiped her hands on her apron, and told him that she did not know, that she was not the same woman he had told to leave 2 months earlier, and that whatever came next, if anything came next at all, would require him to become someone worth choosing again, not because a legal document forced his hand, but because he genuinely wanted to. It was around this time that Claire finally opened Eleanor's private letter, the one she had kept sealed for weeks, unable to bring herself to read it while everything around her was still in chaos. She read it alone, sitting on the porch steps where she had first learned the news, in the same soft morning light that had witnessed the collapse of her old life. Eleanor's handwriting was shaky but warm, and in it she wrote that she had watched, for 15 years, how easily the world overlooked women like Claire, women who gave everything and asked for nothing, and that she had grown determined, in her final years, that Claire would never again be a woman without options, without power, without a door of her own to walk through if she ever needed one. Eleanor wrote that she was not leaving Claire money or shares because she wanted to punish Gregory, though she admitted with dry humor that she wouldn't mind if it humbled him a little, but because she wanted Claire to know, in the clearest way she knew how, that she had been seen, truly seen, and valued for exactly who she was. Claire cried harder reading that letter than she had cried through the entire ordeal with Gregory, because it was not born of loss but of a love so unexpected and so pure that it rearranged something fundamental in how she understood her own worth. For years she had measured herself by how well she served others, how much she gave, how quietly she endured, and here was a woman who had seen straight through all of that sacrifice to the person underneath, and had decided that person deserved protecting. That letter became the quiet turning point of Claire's healing. She began, in the months that followed, to reconnect with the dreams she had shelved decades earlier, using a portion of the inheritance not for revenge or extravagance but to finally open the small bakery she had once imagined as a young woman falling in love with a man full of promises. She called it Eleanor's table, and on opening day, she stood behind the counter in a flour-dusted apron, watching neighbors and old friends and even a few of Eleanor's distant relatives fill the little shop with warmth and laughter, and she felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely and unapologetically herself. Gregory did not disappear from the story, though the marriage, in its old form, could not simply be resurrected by good intentions alone. What emerged instead, slowly, over the better part of a year, was something more honest than either of them had known how to build before. Gregory sold his stake in several of the company's more aggressive expansion projects, scaled back the empire he had once measured his worth by, and began spending actual, unhurried time with his children, showing up to Josephine's college events and Nathaniel's evenings at the office not as a distracted boss but as a present father. He apologized to Claire not once but many times, in different ways, across different months, not expecting forgiveness as a reward for the apology itself, but simply because he had finally begun to understand what he had nearly thrown away. Claire, for her part, did not rush back into the marriage out of habit or obligation. She dated the idea of Gregory cautiously, the way you might approach a house that once burned down, testing each board before trusting your full weight to it. They went to counseling together, separately at first and then jointly, working through not just the affair but the years of quiet neglect that had made the affair possible in the first place. It was slow, unglamorous work, full of setbacks and hard conversations, but it was real in a way their marriage had not been in a long time. As for Vanessa, she gave birth that autumn to a daughter she named Grace, and in an act of grace that surprised everyone who knew her, Claire was the one who suggested, gently, that the child deserved a relationship with her father regardless of how that father had behaved, and that punishing an innocent baby for her parents' mistakes was not a burden Claire wanted any part of building. Gregory, humbled and grateful, became an involved father to Grace as well, splitting his time with a maturity he had never shown before, and Claire, though it took real effort, found a way to hold space for that reality without letting it poison the fragile trust she and Gregory were rebuilding. If this story has touched something in you, I want to gently ask you to pause for just a moment and leave a comment about the lesson that stayed with you most, whether it's about the quiet power of showing up for someone even when no one else does, or about how true strength often looks like calm instead of anger, or about the belief that people, even after they've broken your heart, sometimes still deserve the chance to become someone better. Your words matter to this community, and I would love to hear which part of Claire's journey spoke to you. By the time the dogwood trees on Larkspur Lane bloomed again the following spring, almost exactly a year after that devastating April morning, Claire stood once more on her porch steps, this time with Gregory beside her, both of them older in the particular way that hardship ages a person, but also, somehow, lighter, as though a weight they had carried separately for years had finally been set down and examined honestly. The bakery was thriving. Nathaniel had grown into a young man his mother was proud of in ways that had nothing to do with the family business. Josephine had graduated and moved into her own apartment, carrying with her a fierce belief, learned entirely from watching her mother, that a woman's worth was never contingent on a man's approval. And little Grace, not yet 1 year old, had become, against every painful odds of how she came into the world, a small, unexpected source of joy that the whole family, in their own complicated way, had chosen to embrace rather than resent. Claire often thought of Eleanor in quiet moments, of the woman who had spent 15 years being underestimated by nearly everyone except the one person who kept showing up with soup and patience and time. She thought of how easily kindness is dismissed as weakness by people too blind to see it for the quiet strength it actually is, and how life, in its strange and often delayed justice, has a way of rewarding those who choose compassion even when no one is watching, even when there is nothing obvious to gain. She thought about how close she had come, on that April morning, to believing that her entire worth had been decided by a man who could tell her to leave her own home as though she were a tenant rather than the woman who built it. And she thought about how grateful she was, every single day, that an envelope with no return address had arrived at exactly the moment she needed it most, not to save her marriage, though it eventually helped mend it, but to save her sense of herself. If this story touched your heart today, please take a moment to like this video, leave a meaningful comment about the part that moved you most, share it with someone in your life who might need a little hope this week, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story like this one. Stories like Claire's remind us that even in our darkest, most humiliating moments, when someone we love makes us feel disposable, there can still be an unexpected hand reaching out from somewhere we least expect, reminding us that we were seen all along, that our quiet kindness was never wasted, and that second chances, real ones, built on honesty and humility rather than convenience, are always possible for those brave enough to do the hard, patient work of earning them. Thank you for spending this time with our family here on the channel, and until the next story, may you carry a little more hope, a little more grace, and a little more belief that you, too, are seen exactly as you are.